Welcome to the Our State Book Club podcast. I'm your host, New York Times bestselling author and North Carolina native Wiley Cash. In today's episode, we travel east to Bolton, North Carolina, home of author Jason Mott, whose novel Hell of a Book won the 2021 National Book Award for Fiction. His debut novel, The Return, is the March selection of the Our State Book Club. Today, we'll discuss Jason's life before publication, what it means for him to live where he was raised, and his advice for writers. Jason, thank you for joining us, man.
Thanks for having me.
So I've known you for a very long time, over a decade, about a decade, maybe a little bit more. And I always get a kick out of hearing you talk about your life before The Returned was published. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were doing while you were writing what would become your debut novel?
Yeah, sure. So I graduated from UNCW with a master's in poetry, and I went to work at Verizon Wireless answering phones because that's what you do with a master's in poetry. Like no one's beating your door down to have you analyze sonnets for your life, for your career. So I worked there for about 4 years. During that time, I was constantly writing. I would try to write a manuscript a year while I was there, just trying to really hone my craft, so to speak. But it was one of the worst jobs I've ever had. Like it was just absolutely terrible. People called in angry, and we handled specifically New York Metro. So it was just angry New Yorkers all day, which is a whole other kind of discussion. But yeah, it was a rough job. But the saving grace of that job was it was a job that I left behind. Like when I punched out, the job was done, and I would go home and work on my writing and work on my latest novel. Just try to make that happen. So it was like 4 years of that cycle of like, I would start a book in the spring, write it through summer and into fall, revise fall and winter, and then send it out to agents in, the next spring. And I did that consistently for about 4 years. And then finally I got the good fortune of writing a manuscript that connected with an agent. We signed the deal, revised some more, and then finally sold it to a publisher, and that became The Return.
Yeah. One thing, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, one thing I always love about you and spending time with you is your approach to writing. And I'm sure you get comments. I get a lot of comments too. Comments that begin with, if I had the kind of time you do, I would write a book too. So can you talk about, working a 9-to-5 job that was numbing to your brain, yet going home and making those small sacrifices socially, financially to write. Can you talk about that? Like what was your schedule like during those years when you were working and writing on the side?
Yeah, sure. Even before the Verizon time, I did, associate's degree, I did an undergraduate degree, I did a master's degree, all while holding down a job, all while writing during that period of time for classes, writing for my own personal needs, things like that. And then when I got to Verizon, our schedules changed every 6 months. So I might work a first shift, I might work a third shift, I might work a few hours in morning, a few hours in the afternoon. They had a really erratic kind of scheduling, but every 6 months we had to bid on the schedule that you wanted, and it got revised and updated. And so it was a 40-hour plus week a job, especially if you want overtime, you had to stay extra. And I had to perpetually redefine my writing time. If I was working a later shift, then my writing time was in the mornings. If I was working a morning shift, my writing time was in the evenings. There were some times when my writing time was only at night, like 11 o'clock until like 2 a.m., things like that. But the key was that I made time for it. And I think that's one of the things that people kind of get confused. I think everyone thinks there's just like this period of life when you just have all the time. And that never happens to anybody that I know, at least. We all have 24 hours in a day, and that's all we've got. And during that period of time, you've got to make income. You've got to have family relationships, friend relationships, interpersonal relationships. You need to have a life.
Sure.
And so if writing is going to be a part of your life, you have to carve that time out and build a fence around it and make sure that you perpetually create time in your day to do the writing.
I really like that. Carve that time out and build a fence around it. So you were raised in Bolton. And you still live in Bolton. Can you talk about this place and what rural Eastern North Carolina has meant to your life and to your career?
Yeah, it's been huge. I live in Columbus County in Bolton, as you mentioned, and I live on property that my family has owned since probably the 1930s or 40s. So I'm like fourth generation Mott to live on this property. It's a different type of existence. Like I meet people, few people have that type of existence. And it's something I only recently came to really understand, just how rare it is for people to grow up and still live in a place that they have these familiar roots for like generations. Everyone you meet now is from somewhere else, and that's fine. Like there's no judgment on that. But I just have come to realize recently how rare and unique it is to be someone who is that deeply tied to a specific area and who knows that much about an area, and people in the area know me. Like there are people there that knew my grandparents and knew my parents and so on and so forth. And it creates a very unique kind of attachment to the community, attachment to the area. You really feel like you're a part of the place. For better or worse, like the rumors about small towns and how everyone's in your business, like that's all true as always. So there's definitely that side
Especially
of it.
when you're on the Today Show. I
Yeah,
imagine.
exactly. So there's that side of it, but it pound for pound, like I wouldn't trade it for anything. I really love the fact that like I feel like I know where I exist in the world. I think a lot of people don't really feel anchored. They just kind of are drifting through life in terms of like place. And I'm someone who I've known for my entire life that like this place is a part of who I am and vice versa. And so that's something I think is unique and has really informed my writing.
Yeah, absolutely. Ron Rash, who who was part of the podcast in October, I've heard him say that landscape is destiny. The landscape you're born into and that you cling to portends something about your life in the future. And I think that's certainly true of you. We'll be right back with Jason Mott after this quick break. If you're enjoying this interview with Jason Mott, please join us and Judy Goldman, author of the February Our State Book Club selection, together for a special literary evening at Farrington Village on Thursday, March 20th, when we'll discuss their lives and work. Tickets include hors d'oeuvres and cocktails, and there will be a book signing after the event. Get your tickets and find out more at mcintyresbooks.com/events. So please join me, Jason Mott, and Judy Goldman at Farrington Village on Thursday, March 20th.
This podcast is produced by Our State Magazine, celebrating North Carolina travel, food, history, and culture since 1933. Check out ourstate.com, where you can explore exclusive content like digital stories, YouTube videos, newsletters, and more. To have each month's issue delivered to your mailbox, visit ourstate.com/subscribe and enter promo code BOOKCLUB, one word, Book Club.
That's BOOKCLUB for $5 off any regular or gift subscription. We're back with Jason Mott. So Jason, before you were publishing fiction, you were writing and publishing poetry. Can you talk a little bit about how your work as a poet factors into your work as a prose writer? And while you're thinking about how to answer that brilliant question, I want to say that when I was reading The Returned, when I was rereading it, I read it when it came out. Now I'm reading it 10 years later. I was struck by how beautiful the sentences were and how the strong voice the narrator had. Is that something you brought with you from writing poetry?
Yeah, very much so. And thanks for rereading. I haven't read that book since it got published, so I can barely remember that book in a lot of ways. But yeah, so one thing that I teach students a lot of the time, and when people ask about writing, is whatever your primary genre of writing is, you should try other genres because it will inform and strengthen your primary genre. And so for me, fiction was always my main love. Like that was the thing that I had all of my energy kind of expounded, spent into. And then when I applied to graduate school, I was kind of burned out on fiction. Like I just needed a break from it. And in that time frame leading up to that, I had really gotten into writing sonnets. Like I just fell in love with poetry and I love sonnets. And so I got into doing a lot of sonnets and a lot of persona poetry, in this case, a lot of superheroes and comic books and mythological figures. So throughout graduate school for the next 2 years, I focused exclusively on poetry, exclusively on voice-driven poetry. And the thing that I learned that I didn't even know I needed was before I went to graduate school, before I focused on poetry, My fiction, my prose was very long-winded, like just kind of meandered unnecessarily. And at the end of my time there, my prose became much more succinct, much more powerful, much more efficient in how it functioned. And that's all owed to how poetry works. I mean, poetry obviously is about efficiency and line integrity and that strength of an image to do so much work. So I brought that over into my fiction, and I think that dramatically increased the level of my fiction.
Sure. And I'm thinking about some of your poems, and you write about superheroes, superhero personas, and then a lot of it is about rural life. And I can't remember the title of the poem, forgive me, but there's a gorgeous poem about sitting on the front porch. The speaker is sitting on the front porch with an older sister, talking about childhood and kind of looking out over the landscape. So that duality of superheroes and rural life, how did you come to that in your poetry? I mean, they're rural life, Southern poetry is full of rural poetry, but it's not full of superhero poetry. So how did you hit on superhero as kind of a way of explaining maybe personal stuff?
So for me, it's always just been a part of who I am. This was pre, MCU and all that kind of good stuff. Like this was before the superheroes became cool, quite frankly. So growing up as a kid, like I was a big superhero nerd and I read a lot of comics. And I think this ties back into kind of how I try to approach writing about the South. I think there are 1,000 familiar tropes and ideas about what the South is. And there's a million books about like that version of the South, which is, you're rural, there's an old tree swinging somewhere and which is all beautiful and wonderful and very real to what the South is. But I also think there's a much more contemporary version of the South in which, you do have people living on dirt roads who love art and who love comic books and who know about the world beyond the dirt road that they live on. And so I think for me, that combination is just me trying to bring who I am to the page. Because again, I had read so many authors before me who, very well and very efficiently and very beautifully wrote about the traditional South of cotton fields and cornfields and all that kind of good stuff. And I wanted to use that and put some of who I was, which is, a really weird comic book nerd and D&D playing nerd, like that awkward kid that I wanted to be a part of that story as well. So I hate to call it like the hybridized South, but that's kind of close to what I think it actually is, which is just much more contemporary, kind of rounded South.
Yeah. Hell of a book, and The Return blew the doors off. I mean, The Return was a juggernaut for a debut novel. I mean, it literally went as well as anyone can hope a debut novel does. And then, you had a lot of success with your two novels after that, and then Hell of a Book was an exceptionally praised novel. But no one talks about Jason Mott as a rural writer.
Right.
And all of those books are rural books. And are you thinking about rural life when you're writing?
Yeah, constantly. And I find it hilarious how, I don't get discussed in like the rural writers circles. And I get it, but I also kind of get angry about it sometimes.
Sure, yeah.
Well, not angry, but I just find it to be very hilarious.
And ironic.
Yeah, and ironic because again, I think it ties back to what I was just saying about how like there's a traditional South and that's what you're supposed to write about when you're writing about the South. And so I think the idea of this more contemporary approach to the South, this more kind of rounded version of what the South is, I think that it might be just a little bit too new. And it's not that I'm pioneering or anything like that. Like there are plenty of other authors who have done it and plenty of other authors who will continue to do it. But I think that as far as the perception of what the South is, like there's just a specific type of thing that people want and they expect when they come to a quote unquote Southern story that my stories have, but they're just not completely about that. They also have other things. And so I think a lot of the times when there's discussion of Southern writers, like the content on the page oftentimes isn't quote unquote Southern enough to fall into that category, which I find to be very hilarious.
Yeah, you've always been stuck betwixt and between the not enough of one thing or the other.
That's my entire life.
That's your entire, I understand that. And we don't have to delve too deeply into that, but I totally hear what you're saying. But I think a lot of it has to do with race. When people think about the American South and they think about the rural South, they think about poor white folks living on dirt roads, right? And that's not, that's sometimes the case. It's not always the case. I remember when I lived in Louisiana and was hanging out with Ernest Gaines and I'd go up to his land, there's like black dudes who are farmers and ride horses. And then you go out to a rural Mardi Gras and I'm like, man, we have this idea that like white folks in the American South live in the country and black folks live in New Orleans and Atlanta and Durham, and that's kind of it, right? And so I think that your novels, they don't challenge that because that's not what you're trying to do, but they showcase the unreality of that. And I find that very interesting. So I'm here to advocate for you as a rural Southern writer.
Thank you.
But one thing I mentioned it earlier at the top of our time together that I really love about your approach to writing and your career is that you're not precious about it. And you have a blue-collar attitude about the craft of writing, and you really see it as a pursuit like any other. And I've forgotten what your parents did for work, but I imagine you bring the same work ethic to sitting at the desk that your parents brought to what they did every day. Can you share, along those lines, can you share some advice that you give students who want to write the great American novel but think they have to parrot Jack Kerouac, or somebody who writes about San Francisco or New York City, and that you only write when you're inspired and you don't have to be a reader and you don't have to have this blue-collar mentality? What do you say to those students who come into your workshops?
Yeah, so I think for students like that, they have to approach it as you have to commit to the craft, for lack of a better term. Like, you have to make this commitment to it. If you want it to be your job, if you want it to be the thing you are known for, if you want it to be the profession, all these things that I think a lot of writers, aspiring writers, want, like, you have to treat it like that. You have to put its time aside for it. I mean, my dad worked at a paper mill for most of his life. Before that, he was in the military. My mom was a homemaker. So, like, they were perpetually working. And my dad taught me very early on that, sweat of your brow is kind of what gets you down the road. And so when it came time for writing, like, I committed to writing full time, and like, any waking hour that I had where I was not at my job or not, involved in like interpersonal relationships, not out hanging with friends or, dating and things like that, like, any spare time was devoted to writing. And I kept that going. And I think that early on, our tendency as writers is to parrot and emulate those who inspired us. I think that's totally fair. Even with The Return, like, there are sections of that where I was very much like giving an homage to these writers who had inspired me and kind of gotten me to felt where I was. But at a certain point, you've got to be willing to just charge off the beaten path by yourself and see what happens. I oftentimes describe both the act of writing and the writing profession as like you're kind of wandering through this jungle, and occasionally you run into another writer. It's kind of like meeting some wild person out running through the woods, and they help you find water and keep you on your journey. But for every writer, at some point, like, you are out there by yourself. And I think there's a romanticized loneliness in writing where, you see the movies and the person sitting at a computer by themselves and the muse comes and lightning strikes and they write the book. And that's not really how it is. There is a loneliness, there is community. There are other writers, there are friends you can talk about your writing with, but it's at a certain point, it's you and the page. And you need to figure out what you want to say, not what the people before you were saying and how you're trying to echo them. You really have to ask yourself, like, what do I have to contribute to this? And you have to chase that, which is actually more challenging than people think it is.
Yeah. I can't imagine, and I don't want to, get all weepy on my end of the table, how proud your parents would be of you now. I know you met my dad. He passed several years ago, but you met him before he passed. And I remember when I left my teaching job that I had, I'd gone to graduate school to get this teaching job, and I finally had the job. And then when my first novel sold, I had an opportunity to just do that. And I was terrified of telling my dad because I didn't want him to think that I was no longer going to have a real job. And he said, this has been your dream, so why wouldn't you? This is a job, and it meant everything to like get that like blessing from somebody that I admired so much for his work ethic. So North Carolina lightning round. I'm going to ask you some quick questions.
Okay.
And you can think as deeply or shallowly as shallow as you would like. So first question, what is your favorite thing about rural North Carolina?
Everything, quite frankly. Like, I'm a sucker for rural North Carolina. I love the humidity. I know everybody complains about it. I love the humidity we have in the summer. Like, it's just part of who I am at this point. I love growing muscadines. I love muscadine grapes. I planted some a few years back, which is kind of a family tradition. My granddad planted them, my uncle planted them, and now I've been growing them as well. So yeah, I think everything, like, the muscadines are a big part of it. Like, as I get older and think about it more, like, so much of my childhood was linked to that. I think of that as a North Carolina thing, even though obviously it's not. But that to me is one of the defining moments, defining kind of calling cards of North Carolina is like muscadines. And so actually I love growing them. So that's actually a favorite.
One of my friends up in Asheville is Lumbee. And so he's living in Asheville, which is like the home of craft beer. And he's brewing muscadine beer. Like he brought the muscadine with him to the mountains.
That's
so
awesome.
He still gets muscadines from Eastern North Carolina and brews beer. It's pretty cool.
That's great.
Pretty cool marriage. Next question. Fried okra or sweet potatoes?
Sweet potatoes. I hate okra.
Oh, you hate okra? Oh, I
Yeah,
love
my
okra.
mom could never get me to eat okra. She never could.
Did she fry it up?
She cooked it every way possible. Yes, it was fried often, and I would never touch it.
Oh, man, I still love it. How do you like sweet potatoes? Casserole, baked, fries?
Yeah, baked sweet potato is that's like, I do like a lot of running. And so when I come in from running, like a baked sweet potato at the end of a long run is just amazing. So
Oh, man,
yeah.
that's awesome. Who is one North Carolina writer or writer living in North Carolina who has particularly influenced your writing and career?
Pretty hands down, it would be Philip Gerard. When I was at UNCW in undergrad and graduate, he was a personal mentor to me. Like he took me aside a lot of times. We spent a lot of time in his office, a lot of time getting coffee, and he would just talk me through writing problems and the writing, and not just stuff on the page, but things outside of life, like how you do manage to maintain time for your writing, how you get a job that you maybe don't like, but you still carve out time for your writing. Like I learned a lot of that from him. And even after I graduated from the program, like I could always call him up and we would go get coffee and just discuss something about career, about writing, about whatever. So he very much was a guiding force in my writing journey. And that's actually part of why I kind of took the teaching job at UNCW, because it was after he passed away and I saw an opportunity to kind of fill that gap and pay forward the things that he kind of gave me. So now I'm passing on a lot of what he taught me to the next generation of students. So
Yeah, and I've heard from many of those students in and around Wilmington that you're doing just that. So.
it's good to hear.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great.
All right.
What might it be like underneath the sunrise in a state of flight? Coming back on me, it seems wonderful, the wandering mountain birds on a beach. Never moments ever wasted, turning away from your love. Honeybees, gardens of sweeter fruit, never tasted, no turning to other things. Will you be, will you seem, sweeter fruit, never tasted, don't turn your back on me. Mountains pushing into the sea, mountains into the sea.